All right, folks, we are here at the end of the course. The last time we're going to meet, the last lecture before the final, which of course is going to happen a week from Thursday at 3 o'clock, from 3 to 5 o'clock in this room a week from Thursday. So make sure you keep that in mind. And again, we are not meeting on Thursday. You're going to be free, so make sure you use that time to start preparing for finals, etc. You should have a very clear plan about how you're going to approach the next week and a half. And if you don't, make one. Sit down today. Figure out what your finals are, how much time you have, when you're going to study for what, so that you're not constantly worried about the volume of the work. You're just thinking about what you're doing that moment, that day, and that will take you through this week and a half. You will successfully finish the semester. You will feel good about what you did. You will have a positive outcome, and you'll have a good summer, That's ultimately what it's all about, and I've been emphasizing it the entire semester. I hope you've been listening to me. This whole thing should not just be, like I've said several times, about you just kind of checking off classes so you can graduate. Like, you should be approaching it in the best manner possible, thinking about what you're actually covering, thinking about what you're doing, letting it change you, letting it make you into that better person that this whole process is intended to make you, versus you just kind of taking a back seat and hoping that you make it through. And if you do make it through, if you've been taking that back seat, there's no back seat in life. There's no back seat at those jobs that you guys want. You can't just sit back and just hope everything works out. You are under the microscope once you're out there and they're paying you for the things that you're doing. You have to be ready to bring it. You have to be sure of your ability to do so. And you build that confidence here. This is where it happens. So you should be putting everything you have into this. Again, I hope your futures work out for you. I'm sure it will in large part, but you can get to really high heights in this world if you just show people how dedicated you are and how valuable you can be to them by just giving yourself over to whatever it is you do. And again, that pattern can be easily established here to the point where you don't even have to try later. It just comes out of you, and then it starts to attract the kind of opportunities you deserve for all the hard work that you guys have put in here. Don't let this next week and a half swallow you up. Meet it head on. Don't run away from it. It's what you signed up for. It is the pinnacle of this whole experience. You knew it was coming. There's nowhere to hide. Just face it head on. Take it on, take it down, show the world and yourself what you're capable of. It's going to be great. You're going to feel really good in about a week and a half. For a week and a half, you're not going to feel that great, and that's just the way it goes. That's life. All right, so if you haven't already turned your paper, make sure you do by the time we leave here. I'll be grading your papers and the papers from my other classes for the next week and a half, so I have a lot of work to do. But I'll definitely have everything done by the time your exam comes up, so you'll have that grade, you'll have everything you need to know where you stand going into the final. But again, there isn't a clear-cut formula on getting a certain score in the final to get a certain grade in the class given your performance, because there's a curve in the class. You don't know who's going to pull what out of their hat in this last few weeks. So if there's a really strong showing from the entire class, if you have a strong showing, you're just going to remain right in the middle. But if you can pull away from the crowd and really stand out, that'll really pull you away overall with all your points, so that you wind up in the higher brackets once I create the final curve for the class. And so all you can really do as far as the final is just your best. Just prepare the best you can, aim to get the best score possible, and that will do it. Yes?
For the paper, are you going to write directions on it and you grade it up on the final?
On the other final, I'll have them ready for you, and there'll be a grading sheet on it, and there'll be a breakdown, so you'll be able to know where it all came from. Yeah. All right. Are there any questions about anything you'd like me to address before I move forward with the final lecture for the course? Excellent. All right, so let us finish off the course today by covering chapter 16, which deals with externalities, property rights, and the Coase theorem. So externalities are external costs and benefits that individuals and firms can incur on others. And generally, externalities are not taken into account by the markets. And so it creates complications, obviously. The big external cost that's just sort of like the staple example is pollution. Firms produce, they minimize costs. Part of that minimizing cost might be to just like dump your excess sewage into like the local river or something. And in situations like that, when you have these like negative externalities, then it does become important for the government to play a role and regulate. It's an example of market failure. So there's three cases of market failure. The first is the case of inefficiency caused by market power, and that's the case that we've been sort of looking at and how that affects pricing for the vast majority of the second half of the course. The second case of externalities is, of course, of market failure is externalities, external costs, and even benefits that markets can incur that they don't account for. And then finally, the third case is the case of the goods themselves that are not ideal for the efficient allocation by markets. So the goods we've been talking about are private goods, goods that are excludable. You can stop people from consuming them, and they are rival in consumption. You consume an apple, I can't consume that apple. If goods don't have both of those characteristics, then they fall into one of three other categories. Either they are public goods, in which case they are non-excludable and non-rival in consumption, which means that the best way to allocate them is by the government taking a role in that. Or you can have a common resource which is rival in consumption and not excludable, like rivers, fish in the sea, resources that are available in nature that are not owned by anybody and can be exhausted. That in those situations, you're going to wind up in a situation where too much of those resources are going to be used. So we'll be discussing that today as well. And the other type of good is an artificially scarce good. An artificially scarce good is non-rival in consumption, but it is excludable, like a television show. You can stop someone from watching a television show, but you watching a television show doesn't stop me from watching the television show. And in those cases, because the marginal cost of an additional unit is zero, essentially, once the show has been produced, those are fixed costs. Each additional unit of the show to be viewed by folks costs nothing for the producer. And so the efficient level should happen of supply at the point where price equals marginal cost. But marginal cost is zero, so price should be zero. They can't price at zero because they won't make any money. So therefore, they end up supplying less than is the efficient amount. So again, if the goods don't have these two characteristics, being rival in consumption and excludable, then they are not private goods, which is what we've been talking about the entire course. And each of those constitute a case, a version of the third case of market failure. So again, there is this notion that the government has no role in markets, and that is like the extreme sort of right-wing view of economics, and it's not realistic. There are very clear cases on how markets can cause problems in society, and market failure are the evidence of that. And so government should play a role, and that's ultimately what like this last chapter is about. But there's this thing called the Coase theorem, which we'll talk about today, which basically says that there can be a private market solution to the case of externalities, where if there is an external cost being imposed, then private parties can solve the problem without the government getting involved, but that requires there to be very low transaction costs in order to make that happen. And that's not generally realistic. So we'll look at some examples of how that might work and how it might not work. And then we'll talk finally about positive externalities, and then we'll be done with the course. So by the end of today, you'll never have to listen to me talk again. All right. Any questions about anything? All right. So chapter 16, externalities, property rights, and the Coase theorem. So let's first talk about externalities and their reciprocal nature. So externalities just in general can either be positive or negative. So if they're negative, they're just an external cost, an uncompensated cost that an individual or firm imposes on others. Traffic congestion is an example of an external cost. An individual who chooses to drive during rush hour increases congestion and has no incentive to take into account the inconvenience inflicted on others. People who text while driving increase the risk of accidents that will harm others as well as themselves. Firms that cause pollution are basically, again, like I mentioned earlier, minimizing their costs by not dealing with pollution directly and imposing that cost on others. Of course, there can be external benefits that individuals or firms confer on others without receiving compensation. When you get a flu shot, you're less likely to pass the flu virus on to your roommates. Businesses that develop new technologies also generate external benefits because their ideas often contribute to innovation by other firms. So again, both the external costs and benefits are jointly known as externalities, with the external costs known as negative externalities and the external benefits known as positive externalities. Externalities can lead to private decisions, again, decisions made by private firms, individuals or firms, that are not optimal for society as a whole. So this guy, Ronald H. Coase, he won the Nobel Prize in 1991 for authoring his paper, which our book's author calls the most influential and widely cited economics paper of the post-war era. It was called The Problem of Social Costs, published in 1960. So Coase began with an example involving a doctor whose ability to examine patients was disrupted by the noise of the machinery operated by the confectioner, candy maker, in an adjacent building. Coase's seminal insight was to point out the reciprocal nature of the problem. If the confectioner is held responsible, then he will be hurt. The confectioner is held responsible for the noise, and somehow he's going to have to reduce that. He's either going to have to stop operating or pay for some kind of noise reduction. If he continues, the doctor will be hurt. The doctor will lose patients, will not be able to properly function his business. So the common interest of each party, Coase recognized, is to avoid the larger of these two unpleasant outcomes. Coase pointed out that if the doctor and the confectioner were able to negotiate costlessly with one another, the most efficient outcome would occur regardless of whether the confectioner was held liable or not. So we'll look at like a numerical example to just kind of show how that would work. So suppose the benefit to the confectioner of continuing to make noise, let's say, is $40. While the cost of the noise to the doctor is $60. If the confectioner's only alternative to making noise is to produce nothing, then what will happen if he is made liable for the noise damage? So to be made liable for the noise damage means being required to compensate the doctor for any damage caused by the noise. So the confectioner will examine two options, either shutting down or compensating the doctor. If he stays open, he's going to earn $40, but he will have to, of course, pay the doctor the $60, which the doctor does not make because of the noise, for a net loss of 20 units. If he shuts down, his net gain will be 0. Thus, the confectioner will discontinue operation as a result of this sort of regime where he is going to be held liable. Suppose the law, though, grants him the right to continue operating without compensation to the doctor. If the confectioner stays open, he will then gain the 40 that he'll earn by selling his candy, while the doctor, of course, will lose the 60. But the doctor can compensate the confectioner for the loss of shutting down and still have enough left over to be better off than if the confectioner had stayed open. So again, given that the confectioner would not be held liable by the law, the doctor could just pay him the 40, have him stop working, and and at least he'll have a net gain of 20, which will be better than the 0 from having to shut down. So let's think more generally about this. Let P denote the payment the doctor makes to the confectioner to compensate him for shutting down. P must be at least $40, but no larger than $60, because again, that's the most benefit the doctor gets from operating his office. If both the doctor and the confectioner are rational meaning they're making the choices that benefit them the most, and can negotiate costlessly with one another, the efficient outcome for the confectioner to shut down will occur regardless of the legal regime. So again, we can look at that via this table here. Here under the regime where there is a law and the government has stepped in, then the confectioner is forced to shut down. The doctor earns their 60, and the total would be 60 overall as far as like the overall benefit to society, how much the firms are able to collectively make. If the government does not get involved, then the doctor will pay the confectioner some amount to shut down P, which has to be greater than or equal to 40 and less than or equal to 60. So 60 minus P will be the doctor's benefit. Confectioner will have a benefit of P, that payment made by the doctor. And so the total benefit will equal the sum of the two, which in this case will be 60 as well. So these are the kind of numerical examples that he used in his paper to kind of highlight why maybe given certain circumstances, if negotiation costs are basically 0 or very low, that the efficient outcome will result regardless of whether the government gets involved or not, implying that maybe there is not a role in government in these problems of externalities. Let's look at another scenario. Suppose the benefit to the confectioner of operating, in this case, is 60, and the benefit to the doctor of a noise-free environment is only 40. Assume the doctor must shut down if the noise continues. This time, the efficient outcome is for the confectioner to continue operating. If he's not liable for the noise damages, then the confectioner will stay open, and the doctor will have only the option to shut down in that case. So again, if there is a law that basically says that the noise must be dealt with, then the confectioner will stay open, pay the doctor 40. He earns 60, has 20 net, and so overall society will have a benefit of 60. If there's no intervention by the government and no law is imposed saying that the confectioner must stop making the noise, then the doctor will shut down, the confectioner will continue operating, and overall, again, society will have the same amount of benefit. So again, regardless of where the burden lies on either the one creating the external cost or those being afflicted by it, with or without government intervention, if there's no negotiation cost, then we'll have the most efficient outcome, is what Coase was trying to say. But let's look at another scenario. Now the confectioner who makes 40 from operating has access to, let's say, a soundproofing device that will completely eliminate the noise from his machines. The cost of the device is going to be $20. The doctor will gain 60 if there's no noise and 0 if there is noise. So going back to the numbers from the original scenario. So in this situation, if the government were to step in and say that the confectioner could be held liable for the noise pollution, and the confectioner will install the soundproofing device, which is 20. That'll hurt his earnings from operating by 20. Leave him with 20. Doctor gets 60 from operating, so collectively they will earn 80. And if the government does not get involved, then the doctor will pay the confectioner P to install the soundproofing. So some amount, either the amount of the soundproofing, which is 20, or some amount between that and the most benefit the doctor gains from operating, which is 60. So the doctor will get 60 and have to pay some price, and then that will be given to the confectioner, who will spend 20 on the soundproofing and have 20 left over. So the sum of these two, again, gets us to that efficient outcome of 80, regardless of whether the government is involved or not. Now the doctor can escape the noise damage by moving his examination room to the other side of the office. The noisy room in which he now examines patients could then be used for storage. The cost to the doctor of rearranging the office is 18. So with this new option available, the doctor is the one who is able to eliminate the noise damage at the lowest possible cost. So again, if the government is involved, then the confectioner will pay the doctor some amount to rearrange the office, which will be either 18 bucks or less than 20 bucks. And so the doctor will wind up with 42 plus that P, making 60 or more. The confectioner will pay out money, either, again, between 18 and 20 to the doctor to move the office around. And so, again, the overall benefit is 82. And if there is no government intervention, then the doctor rearranges his office at his own expense, incurs the cost of $18. The confectioner makes 40, he makes 42, together they make 82. Again, same outcome, regardless of whether the government is involved or not. So again, we get the efficient outcome no matter which legal regime we choose. So the pattern revealed in the preceding example may be stated formally as the Coase theorem. When the parties affected by externalities can negotiate costlessly with one another, an efficient outcome results no matter how the law assigns responsibility for damages. Coase's classic paper became a subject of great controversy, though. Many took him to say that there's no real role for government in solving problems related to pollution, noise, and other externalities. Coase stated clearly that this conclusion holds only for a world in which parties can negotiate with one another at relatively low cost. He reorganized that for many important externalities he recognized that for many important externalities this assumption is not satisfied, that there are transaction costs in trying to negotiate these kind of agreements. Transaction costs can take the form of opportunity costs in terms of time that has to be spent trying to negotiate. They can take the form of paying for legal assistance from lawyers, having to draw up contracts, negotiate with opposing parties, etc. So another serious barrier to negotiation is the problem of how ultimately to divide that surplus. Because again, if there is a cost, then there will be different outcomes depending on whether the government is involved or not, and therefore it just calls to question, like, who should bear the burden of the extra cost. All right, so let's again assume that the doctor has a gain in the noise-free environment of 40. The gain to the confectioner from an unfettered operation is 60. The confectioner can buy the soundproofing device at a cost of 20. It costs the two $25 to negotiate an agreement. For negotiation to be worthwhile, they must be able to share this cost in some way that makes each of them better off than if they did not negotiate. In this case, we get the most efficient result only if the confectioner is liable. So again, if the government is involved in the situation, then the confectioner will install the soundproofing at his own expense, pay the 20 bucks. He winds up with 40, doctor winds up with 40, which is his benefit from operating in a noiseless environment, and collectively society winds up with 80 units of benefit. But if the government is not involved, then the confectioner does not install the soundproofing device, and the government and the doctor will have to shut down. And the confectioner in that case will wind up with 60, and so the total surplus in society will be 60. And the reason for this is because the doctor would have to pay $25 to just be able to engage in that kind of negotiation with the confectioner in order to get him to then use the soundproofing device, which he would have to pay for as well, which is 20. So that's 45, which again would put the confectioner in a situation where it would put the doctor in a situation where he would be less than zero, so he would be negative in operating costs, and therefore it doesn't make sense for him to even engage in that kind of costly negotiation, and therefore we wind up with a less efficient outcome as a result of that. So one last example, same as the last, except the confectioner no longer has a soundproofing option. The doctor has the option of avoiding the noise by rearranging his office, which will cost him 18. Here we get the efficient outcome when the confectioner is not liable. So in this case, if the confectioner is held liable, then the doctor will earn the 40. the confectioner will earn 20, and the total will be 60. Whereas if the government does not get involved, in that case, the doctor will spend the $18 to, again, rearrange his office. The confectioner will get the 60, and then the total benefit to society will be 82. So over here, the reason why the confectioner cannot pay the doctor to rearrange the office is because there is that extra cost of negotiation, which would be $25, which would also put the confectioner in the negative zone, which would not allow them to even engage in that kind of negotiation, which would result in a better, more efficient outcome. And so because there is costly negotiation, then in that case, we do not get the same efficient outcome, regardless of whether the government is involved or not. And so ultimately, the point of these examples was to highlight the fact that, like, if there is costly negotiation, then sometimes it is good for the government to get involved, sometimes it's bad for the government to get involved. And again, it depends on, like, the benefits to the parties in conflict and the cost of the solution on top of the cost of the negotiation. And so it just basically kind of establishes, like, how there isn't a clear-cut approach in these cases, but it also establishes that in most situations where there is costly negotiation, that there is a role for the government to play, and that we should not rule it out completely. All right, so let's look at just a quick practice problem just to kind of look at how the numbers might work in a different scenario. So Anne and Ben are next door neighbors. Anne wants to throw an epic party tonight, but Ben wants to be rested for his midterm tomorrow morning. If Anne throws a party, then Ben will be unable to go to sleep. Suppose Anne's payoff from having a party is 115 units, and Ben's payoff from sleeping is 65 units. Furthermore, Anne and Ben can, in this case, negotiate costlessly, and there are no noise laws. So ultimately, the question is, what will be Anne's payoff? All right, so again, this is the benefit to Anne of having the party, 115, and the benefit to Ben of sleeping is 65. There's no noise laws, so she can't call the cops. So what will be Anne's payoff in this case? So you're assuming that she's going to do the right thing and compensate Ben. But, I mean, is that realistic? I mean, in reality, yes. Like, a lot of us are ethical. But, like, these examples are meant to sort of parallel the way businesses would interact. And let's face it, businesses don't do things out of the goodness of their heart. So unless they are forced to compensate somebody for the external cost, then by what's called a Pigouvian tax is what it's called, which makes them internalize the externality, then they won't do it, right? There's no incentive for them to do so. So Ben would be willing to pay Anne up to $65 to not throw the party, but Anne stands to gain 115 by throwing the party. Therefore, Anne would throw the party, and her payoff would be 115. This is the efficient outcome since it maximizes the total payoffs. All right, so in that case, what will be Ben's payoff? 0, right? The party goes on, and he does not sleep. Exactly. All right. Suppose there is now a noise ordinance so that Ben can call the police, shut down the party, and get a full night's sleep. What's going to be Anne's maximum payoff now?
65.
So his payoff from sleeping is 65, right? She has a payoff of 115 from the party. So what can be the max that she'll get from the party? There's a law that says that he can call the cops and stop the party, right? So what would she need to do to stop him from calling the cops? Pay him at least 65 bucks, right? So to persuade Ben not to call the police, Anne has to pay him at least 65. Thus, her maximum payoff in that case would be 50. All right. What is Ben's minimum payoff from the noise ordinance? So again, from this situation, what is the minimum that he could get? 65 is the minimum he could get, but he could actually, if he knew how much it was worth to her to have the party, he could negotiate more. So 65 is the minimum. Suppose we're back in situation 1, except Anne has learned that loud music can permanently damage hearing. Her payoff from throwing the party is now 50 units. So what will be Anne's minimum payoff now? So again, like this is a situation where the loud music can permanently affect her. So her payoff, so her value from the party is a lot less than what it was in the original scenario. So what's her minimum payoff now? So there's no law. So there's no law, so she won't call the cops, right? I mean, so Ben won't call the cops. So there's no threat of that. So 50, right? Like she'll throw her party. Like he can't do anything about it, right? Ben can now compensate Anne 50 units and still come out ahead with 15 for himself. So hence, Anne does not throw the party and gets a minimum payoff of 50. All right, so suppose we have the situation in part 5, but with the noise ordinance. So now there is a law that would stop her from throwing the party. What is her payoff now? Zero, right? She can't do anything about it. Like she values the party at 50. He values his sleep at 65. He can't pay her the 65, right? So Anne will no longer want to offer Ben 65, not to call the police, so she cancels her party and gets a payoff of 0. Let's suppose again that Anne's payoff from having a party is 115 units, Ben's payoff from sleeping is 65, and there is no noise ordinance. When negotiation costs are small, the efficient outcome still occurs regardless of liability. What is the minimum negotiation cost such that the efficient outcome need not occur? Fractional numbers are not possible. So again, she values it at 115. His payoff is 65. There's no law. So what's the minimum cost to negotiate that would stop them from being able to form an agreement that would allow for the best outcome? So let's go just a little bit higher than that. 50. What's just more than $50? $50.01, right? Just 1 penny above the actual cost is what will stop them from actually being able to negotiate the efficient outcome. All right, so Coase theorem is it's an important theorem. It's an important idea, and again, like the things that we introduce in this class, like we introduced them very lightly to you. And the numerical examples you saw are basically straight out of his paper that won him the Nobel Prize. So to make important points, you don't need to be extremely complicated, but they can have profound impacts if the ideas at their root, have a lot of meaning. And these ideas do have a lot of meaning, and they have been used to justify both interventions by government and no interventions by government. And again, it's the actual issues in practice are complicated, and so the arguments in those situations can get very intricate, but the basis for the logic is not that complicated, and that's what all this was meant to highlight. All right, anyway, let's talk about property rights and their importance to basically everything we've been talking about the entire semester. So no free market economy can function successfully without laws that govern the use of private property. We see throughout the world that those economies that have not developed, that are what we call emerging markets, that one of the sort of main characteristics of all of them is that they don't have strong institutions to protect property rights. They may not even have property rights, but if they do, they might have really sort of corrupt legal systems that don't allow those property rights to be enforced. And so one of the big sort of drivers of economic growth is international investors coming into a country and sort of pouring in money. And if investors can't have their investments protected, then they won't invest And so that has been sort of a big hindrance to a lot of economies kind of taking off in the way that we've seen like China and India, which both of them still have some issues with respect to property rights, but have been improving them and have made sort of oaths to clean them up by a certain time. Like I think China within the next few years is supposed to have a set of laws that is applicable everywhere throughout the country, whereas now like they have various laws in different places that are meant to be international, they're meant to be national laws, and so it obviously complicates matters and creates ambiguity and uncertainty for business practices. So again, property rights grant owners of property the right to exclude others from using it without permission. The exceptions to this right can be explained with the Coase theorem. So we'll highlight a quick sort of example of why sometimes there are exceptions to property rights. So the question here is everybody's favorite type of approach to analyzing things, the economic naturalist approach. This one being 16.2, asking the question, why does the law of trespass not apply along waterfront property? So as we know, in many cultures of the world, people regard a stranger walking across their land as an intrusion. The trespasser confers a negative externality on the property owner, right? Like there's sort of this sense of threat or danger that can be imposed on somebody when they have a stranger walk into their property. This is usually resolved with laws that protect the property owner from trespass. Lakefront property, though, is often excluded from these laws. This has to do with the high cost of avoiding walking along the land. Suppose that there's 3 lakefront properties and someone at A wants to visit someone at C. So in order for someone at A to visit someone at C, in order to not pass through B, they'd have to go up there like kind of rocky path along this road, then go down this rocky path to get to C. Big hassle, a lot of time spent, dangerous. Whereas if they could just walk along the lakefront, they can get to C's property with no problem. So again, the path down to a property is difficult to maneuver. Because the costs of traveling around are so much larger than the cost of the direct path along the lakeshore, the law of trespass makes an exception for these properties. With respect to potential trespass on both the lakeshore and other properties, negotiation is prohibitively costly on a case-by-case basis. So the law of property defines rights of access in a way that on average leads to an efficient outcome. So it makes that exception in order to avoid the costly negotiation that would have to be engaged in order to set up an agreement for, a specific person to be able to walk through the property of this person, maybe at specific times of the day, etc. Like they'd have to get very specific. That involves like a lot of contingencies and contracts that involve lawyers. That is very costly. So it gives most property owners the rights to exclude people, but withholds the right from the owners of lakeshore properties from that exclusion completely. So again, that's sort of a reflection of like the Coase theorem. So the details of various property laws have a great deal of economic structure. They embody sophisticated, if often implicit, calculations about how to reach the most efficient solution to practical problems involving externalities. The very existence of private property may be traced to early attempts to deal with externalities. So we'll sort of track the example of the tragedy of the commons to sort of highlight this. So when we're talking about the commons, we're talking about a common resource, one that again is exhaustible, is exhaustible but non-excludable. And it's exhaustible because it is rival in consumption. So to track the existence of property rights, consider the question of what would happen in a society that lacked a well-developed institution of property rights. So suppose, we're going to look at an example. Suppose a village has 6 residents, each of whom has a wealth of, let's say, $100. Each resident may either invest his money in a government bond, which pays 12% per year, or use that money, that $100, to buy a year-old steer, which can graze on the village commons, there being no individually owned grazing lands in this village. So again, the village commons is just the land collectively owned, well, not owned like in terms of legal right, but like the village kind of like collectively owns it. Like they're all in agreement that it belongs to everybody. And so it is non-excludable. You can't exclude anybody from using it, but it can be rival in consumption. Your use of the land can lead to me not being able to use the land. So year-old steers and government bonds, let's say, each cost $100. So the cost of a bond or the steer is the same. Steers require no effort to tend and can be sold for a price that depends on the amount of weight they gain during the year. Yearly weight gain, in turn, depends on the number of steers that graze on the commons. So if there's only one steer grazing on the common, then the amount that a 2-year-old steer would get on the open market would be 120. But if there's 2 steers, then each one would get a 118, 3, 114, and so on and so forth. So we see that the more number of steers there are grazing on the land, the less weight they will individually gain, because again, they are sharing the amount of pasture they can eat, which means that they will be worth less in the open market. So as long as each villager cannot control access to the commons by cattle owned by others, the income maximizing strategy will be to send an extra steer out onto the commons only if its price next year will be at least $112. Because again, they could spend $100 on a bond, on a treasury bill, and get a 12% return on it. So that's essentially their opportunity cost for owning a steer. So with this pattern of investment, village income from investment will be 14 from each of 3 steers and 12 from each of the 3 bonds for a total of 78. So again, looking at if the villagers are again left to their own devices to just have as many steers grazing as is beneficial to them individually, then they will wind up grazing 3 steer. Going beyond that, on average, each will generate $111 worth of sales. But again, the 3 will generate 114, which will be worth it to 3 people. And then you have those 3 other people who will buy the bond, and then they'll each get 12. And so collectively, the village will wind up with $78 in benefit. Of course, this is not the largest possible income the villagers could have earned. From the point of view of the village as a whole, the investment rule for steers should be send an extra steer onto the commons if and only if the marginal contribution to the value of the total herd after 1 year is greater than or equal to 112. So once again, we run into this problem of like average versus marginal. Because there is this common resource and there isn't a way of imposing some sort of like rule of law onto it that will lead to the most efficient outcome, then each individual will try to maximize their own individual benefit, which is ultimately the average benefit versus the marginal. And we will get a less efficient outcome collectively than we would have had the marginal approach been used. So sending a 3rd steer onto the commons resulted in a total herd with 3 steer times 114 price each in the open market, which is $342, which is only $106 more than the value of a herd with 2 steers. So the marginal value of an extra steer, that 3rd steer, only improved the overall value to the village of $106, which is less than the $112 they would gain by reselling that bond and getting that $12 return. So total village income is maximized by actually buying 4 bonds and sending only 2 steers onto the commons. This pattern results in an income of $48 from bonds and $36 from steers for a total of $84. Obviously, 84 is better than 78. So essentially, not having this extra system in place, property rights, the government sort of imposing a rule is an example of like just letting the invisible hand reign free, right? Like letting what Adam Smith termed the invisible hand, like the free market, just kind of do its own thing and not have any kind of intervention by the government. So that led to a result that wasn't ideal. So the reason that the invisible hand failed to produce the best social result is that the individual villagers ignored an important externality. The criterion for deciding to send another steer was to look only at the price increase that would occur for that particular steer. they took no account of the fact that sending an extra steer would cause existing cattle to gain less weight, so lower the value of the existing cattle in the open market by adding additional steer. Pasture land is a scarce resource in this example, and the villagers failed to allocate it efficiently because they were allowed to use it for free. Again, this is a case of what's called a common resource, and it is an example of why markets can fail with respect to allocating these types of resources. The problem would be solved if individual villagers could own pasture land and exclude others from using it, in which case they would consider the marginal benefit of additional steers versus the average benefit. So if the village government decides to put the pasture land up for auction, the question is, what price should it put it up for? So anyone who buys the pasture land has the right to restrict the number of steers to 2, which is the income maximizing amount. So again, a common resource is one in which it has non-excludability, but it is rival in consumption. And so the solution there is to make it excludable and therefore make it a private good, which can then be allocated efficiently by a market in the way that we've been talking about this entire semester. So now we're trying to figure out what price should this public land be sold for. So anyone who buys a pasture land has the right to restrict the number of steers to 2, which is the income maximizing amount. Having control over the commons then yields a surplus of $12 a year over the income available to a person able to buy only government bonds. So again, the benefit from buying the land is that you would put 2 steers out, you buy 4 bonds, and that will leave you with $84 versus just buying 6 bonds and getting $72, and therefore the net benefit of the land would be $12. So it follows that the price of the pasture land at auction will be $100, the price of a bond that pays an annual income of $12. The village government could take the $100 raised from the auction of its pasture land and distribute it among the 6 villagers for an average payment, in this case, of $16.67. So in early societies, it was a general practice for important resources such as pasture land and fisheries to be owned in common. So you'll hear about like the commons, like that being sort of like the paradigm of like how resources were managed. And this was really during the time of when we had, like kingdoms, and you had royalty, and like you had the aristocracies below that, and then below that you had basically everybody else, and none of them really owned the land. The land was like entitled to like the royals by God or whatever, by divine right. But again, like they did collectively use the land to benefit them, and then of course the aristocracy and those above them. But then the problem was that this led to overexploitation of the resource. So the figure illustrates the problem of individual villagers who have the option of working at a factory with a wage of, let's say, W a day, or of keeping all the fish they can catch from the village lake. So this example is going to highlight again why left to their own devices with managing of resources as commons, that we will get to an inefficiently high level of exploitation of the resource, which will ultimately be a hindrance to the overall society as far as like efficiency. So the example is one, again, tracking fishermen, and they have an opportunity cost of fishing of the wage that they could be earning at the local factory where they could be working. The curve labeled AP is the average product, and it shows how the average catch per fisherman varies with the number of fishermen, while the MP is the marginal product, and it shows the change in the total catch as a function of the number of fishermen. So if fishermen get to keep whatever they catch, their decision rule will be to fish up to X prime. So if, again, left up to their own devices to figure out whether or not it's worth it to them individually to go fishing or not versus work, then they will overexploit the fishing resource, and they will fish at, in this case, at X prime, and I'll show why that's inefficient in a second. And that's the point where their average. That's the point where their average product is equal to their wage. Where again, like the opportunity cost of fishing is equal to the average benefit of fishing. So at X prime, the value of the total catch is exactly equal to the total income that the villagers who fish could have earned by working in the factory. The socially optimal allocation is to fish only up until X prime, though, X star, though, this amount, the point at which the wage equals the marginal product, and for all remaining villagers to work in the factory. At this allocation, the villagers who fish will earn a total of S star, the shaded area, more than they could have earned by working in the factory. So if we look at the extra benefit of sending an additional fisher person fishing as opposed to going to the factory, then that's essentially us taking into account the overall benefit to society of an additional fisherman. So that will happen up until the point where the marginal product equals the opportunity cost of the wage. At that level, each of these fishermen are going to earn an average product of this amount. So the difference between that and their wage times the amount of fish is going to equal the surplus that the collective village could gain from fishing in this more efficient way. So this is the amount that is lost because of, again, folks being left to their own devices to react to their own personal incentives. So if villagers are given free access to fish in the lake, the allocation that sends X star out to fish will not be stable. Because each fisherman will be earning more than the villager who works in the factory, factory workers will have an incentive to switch to fishing. If there wasn't some sort of law that said this is how much we are allowing fishermen to fish, then obviously if this were the amount that there were a fisherman, then they would be making more than everybody else who's working at the factory. That would lure the people from the factory to fish, and therefore that would get us to this point, which is going to exhaust the resource. So switching will stop only when X prime have gone out to fish, making earnings in the two alternatives the same. So again, that's the point that would occur if there was no sort of legal regime to control the amount of fishing. As in the earlier pasture land example, the additional fishermen ignore the externality they impose on the existing fishermen. They don't think about the fact that by having more and more folks going out fishing, that they're depleting the resource and they're ultimately sacrificing the amount of surplus that the collective could enjoy. So each looks only at the size of his own catch, ignoring the fact that his presence makes everyone else's catch smaller. In order to sustain the efficient allocation, something must be done to limit access to the lake. The simplest approach is to charge people for the right to go fishing. If the fishing fee were set at the difference between the average product and the wage, so that amount there, the optimal allocation would result automatically from the income maximizing decision of individual villagers. So essentially, instead of allowing them to just kind of figure this out on their own, you make the fishing essentially equivalent to working at this level here. So at this level here, either you can work and earn a wage, or you can go fishing and earn this difference, but then you'd have to pay this difference just for the right to fish, which would essentially get you back to that point where it's equally beneficial to you to fish or work at the factory at that point. And thus, no more than this amount of folks would wind up fishing. So here, as in the pasture land example, the problem was that individuals overutilized a productive resource they were allowed to use for free. The invisible hand mechanism can function properly only when resources sell for prices that reflect their true economic value. All right, second to last practice problem of the semester. There's one more after this. All right, so a town located near a lake has, let's say, 200 boats, which can be used for two different purposes. Boats can be used for fishing, where they catch fish according to the following production function, where F is the number of fish caught, B is the number of boats employed for fishing. Alternatively, the boats can be rented to a tourist company for $80 a day. So that's the opportunity cost of going fishing, 80 bucks a day that they could earn by just renting out their boats. Fish sell for $2 per fish in the local market. Part 1. If the owner of each boat decides individually whether or not to use the boat for fishing, how many boats will be used for fishing? Assume that fractional values are possible. So remember, where was that the amount of fishermen wound up going out to fish in that example we just looked at? It was the point at which the wage was equal to what? It wasn't that. It wasn't that. It's without. So it was the situation where there were no limitations and people were just left up to their own devices to make their decisions. So what was that amount of fishermen? Where did it happen? At the intersection of the wage and what? It was one of the two curves. It was the average product, right? It was the average product. So it was the point where the average product was equal to the opportunity cost. So individuals will add their boat to the fishing fleet until their individual revenue from fishing equals the opportunity cost of using their boat for fishing, or the average revenue equals the marginal cost. In this case, it's opportunity cost of one boat. So the opportunity cost of using the boat is equal to 80. The revenue is price times the number of fish each individual expects to catch, which is given by the average product of boats. So F divided by B. So that will give us the average product, and then we multiply it times the price to figure out how much that's worth in the open market, and then we set that equal to the marginal cost. So this equals, so 7,000 minus 60B is what we got there, and then the price for each fish is $2. Set that equal to the opportunity cost, which is $80 a day, and then we can solve for the amount of boats that will be sent out. So doing some math there gets us to 116 boats. So 116 boats will be sent out to fish, given that people are left up to their own sort of devices to figure out what's best for them. Part 2. If the town decided the optimal use for the boats collectively, how many boats would be used for fishing? Assume again that the fractional values are possible. So how did the optimal allocation get solved for in that last graphical example? It happened at the point where something else was equal to the wage. It wasn't the average product, it was the marginal product, right? So since the town is deciding collectively, they will set the marginal revenue from fishing equal to the marginal cost. So the total revenue is equal to the amount produced times the price, which is equal to 14,000B minus 120B squared. So the marginal revenue is thus equal to the derivative of this. So what's the derivative of this term here? 14,000. What's the derivative of this term? Negative 240B. Very good. So that's our marginal revenue. Set that equal to the marginal cost. Do a little bit of algebra there, and that's going to get us to 58 boats. So 58 boats will benefit this fishing village collectively. What is the gain in social welfare from collective decision making? All right, so let's look at the amount of social welfare generated from individual decision making as manifests as total revenue. All right, so the total revenue from fishing is going to be equal to 14,000B minus 120B squared is the revenue function. Again, this is the quantity times the price gets us revenue. There's 116 boats that will be sent out under that scenario. So that's going to yield $9,280. But there's 200 boats overall. And so those other boats are going to be rented out for $80 a day by the tourist company. So that's going to get us a total of, in this case, $16,000. From collective decision making, there's going to be revenue from the fishing from 58 boats, which is going to equal $408,320. And then the remaining boats of 142, they're each going to earn that $80 a day in revenue from the tourist company, which is 11,360. And so we see that collectively, by this village, using the collective rule of setting their marginal product equal to the opportunity cost of their boat, the marginal cost of the boat, that the overall benefit to the society increases dramatically in this case from $16,000 to $419,680. So a little bit more of a stark example on how if a resource is used efficiently when you are taking into consideration that there are externalities to be accounted for, and we can include that externality in the price of doing something, that we can collectively wind up with a much more efficient result. So in this case, it's the difference between the two, which is $403,680. All right, and finally, let's look at positive externalities and see how the Coase theorem can tell us something about us getting the most benefit out of a situation that it could be just like just your standard sort of transaction that might occur in a market, but it might create a positive benefit to others, such as like the investment of R&D that creates, like certain technology that can then be used in a variety of other technologies to, create the internet, change the world, etc. That's a form of a positive externality. So the Coase theorem can be applied to positive externalities as well. When a beekeeper and an apple grower operate on adjacent properties, the activities of each confer positive externalities on the other. These positive externalities, if ignored, will result in suboptimally small levels of both apple and honey production. If negotiation between them is costless, though, the beekeeper can offer to subsidize the orchard owner for planting more trees. The orchard owner, likewise, can offer payments to induce the beekeeper to enlarge his apiary. With either positive or negative externalities, inefficiencies result only if it is costly or otherwise impractical to negotiate agreements about how to correct them. All right, so let's just examine how this works via the final practice problem of the semester, folks. Congratulations. So Jen and Emma live on adjacent plots of land. They each have two potential uses for their land. The present value of each depends on the use adopted by the other, as summarized in the table. All the values in the table are known to both parties. So we can sort of set up this situation as a normal form representation of the game where Jen can either apple grow or pig farm, and Emma can either rent housing or beekeep on her property. So each, again, has two options for what they can do on their property. If they are able to somehow coordinate apple growing with beekeeping, then they'll wind up with the best possible outcome. So this, if Jen pig farms and Emma rents housing, then that's $850. Apple growing and rental housing is $900. Apple growing and beekeeping is $1,050. And then pig farming and beekeeping is $950. So collectively, this is the best option for everybody. But that's not the option that they're going to choose based on the payoffs and given their own selfish motivation. So we can examine what the likely outcome is just via our standard analysis of a normal form representation of a game. So if Jen, in response to Emma rental housing, can either apple grow or pig farm. Obviously, $450 is better than $200, so she would end up pig farming. And in response to Emma beekeeping, again, she can either apple grow or pig farm. Pig farming is better, so she would pig farm no matter what. So she has a dominant strategy to pig farm. And then Emma, in response to Jen, apple growing, can either rent housing or beekeep. Obviously, rental housing is better. And in response to pig farming, beekeeping is better. So she does not have a dominant strategy, and she will choose a different option depending on what Jen chooses. So we know that Jen would choose this one, pig farming, and thus Emma would also choose. So given that Jen was pig farming, she can either rent housing or beekeep. 500 is better than 400, so she would choose to beekeep. So this would be then the Nash equilibrium for this situation. And thus, we would not get the efficient outcome, the most beneficial outcome to both parties. But maybe we can if they can sort of negotiate. But let's say there are negotiation costs of 150, and the question is, what activities will the two pursue on their land? So again, Jen, in response to Emma renting housing, will pig farm, and in response to beekeeping, will pig farm. So she will want to pig farm no matter what. And obviously, Emma wants her to grow apples here in order for her to get the better outcome. Well, actually, she wants this outcome here, the 700. But collectively, this is the best outcome. But Emma would want Jen to, so given that Jen would pig farm, then Emma would wind up, she actually, what am I saying? I'm getting a little lost here because I'm hungry. I'm very hungry. I'll be honest with you guys. I'm starving. All right, and this apple and honey thing is driving me nuts. Anyway, so she would want Jen to apple grow because obviously that would benefit her more. But in order to get her to do that, she would need to talk to her, and that would cost $150. So therefore, we would wind up with this Nash equilibrium here. With transaction costs of 150, it's impractical to negotiate an agreement. Jen will raise pigs, her dominant strategy, and Emma will keep bees. So in order for Emma to get Jen to apple grow in response to her renting housing, then she would have to pay $150. What did I do there? I forget what I did here. Anyway, just let's keep going with the text there. All right. Raise dominant strategies. Yes, pig farm, and then. All right. So in order for okay, I remember what I did. Sorry, I'm totally off right now. In order to induce Jen to switch from pig farming to apple growing, Emma would have to pay Jen at least $250 in order to make her indifferent between pig farming and apple growing. So she would pay her the $250, but in order to even get her to agree to that, she would have to pay an extra $150 to get that agreement, which means that her payoff would go down to $300, which then would not make it worthwhile for her to even engage in that kind of transaction. All right. So obviously, this is the best option for everybody. And in order for Jen to choose this option here, then Emma would have to at least compensate her $50 there in order to make her indifferent between pig farming and apple growing. And in order for that to happen, she would have to pay those $150 just to pay for a negotiator. And so in that case, it wouldn't be worthwhile for Emma to do it because she would wind up with $450 here. She gets $500 there, so she wouldn't engage in it. So again, because the negotiation costs are high, then the efficient outcome does not occur. B, if there are no negotiation costs, what activity will the two pursue on their land? So again, Jen has a dominant strategy to pig farm. Jen would benefit from Emma would benefit from Jen choosing to apple grow, and so she would have to compensate Jen at least $250 for this option, and just $50 for this option. And so we would wind up with this situation here because by paying her the $50, she would only lose $50 there, which would still get her a better benefit than here. And so it would then make it worthwhile. It would still keep her give her a better option of beekeeping than rental housing, and so then she would want to beekeep. I'm sorry, I'm butchering this whole thing, but nonetheless, I hope you're getting the point. So if there are no transactions, Emma will keep bees and Jen will grow apples since the choice maximizes their combined profits. In part C, what is the maximum net income Jen can earn in parts A and B above? So in part A, if the transaction costs are high, then obviously the most that Jen can earn is $450 because we will result in that Nash equilibrium. But if there are transaction costs, if there are no transaction costs, then the most efficient outcome will occur. Jen would have to be compensated 50 at least, but she knows that Emma benefits quite a bit from that option, and so then she could talk Emma into paying her more, the difference between 450 and 650, so another extra $100 in order to make her indifferent between these two, actually, is what I meant to say. Anyway, you get the point. We're done with the class. Congratulations. Good job, folks. So this is it, folks. Like the exam, again, is a week from Thursday. Don't get bogged down by all your responsibilities. Don't let this time destroy you. Just stay in the moment. Focus on what you have to do today, tomorrow, the next day. You'll get through it one day at a time, one thing at a time. It'll all be over soon. You're going to do really well. And I wish you all the very best. I'll see you in about a week and 2 days. Take care.